The walls of Jericho were already ancient when the events in the biblical account took place. This is the detail almost everyone misses. By the time an army is described marching around them, these fortifications represented thousands of years of accumulated engineering, built and rebuilt by a city that had been defending itself longer than almost any other settlement on Earth. To understand how those walls were really built and why their collapse carried the weight it did, you have to start with a fact that reframes the entire story. Jericho was not a young city with fresh walls. It was one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world, and its defenses were the product of an engineering tradition stretching back into the depths of prehistory. The archaeological record at Jericho reaches astonishingly far back. Excavations at the site have uncovered fortifications dating to a period so early that they predate the invention of pottery. And among the most remarkable discoveries is a massive stone tower and wall system built thousands of years before the events most people associate with the city. This ancient tower, constructed of undressed stones fitted together without mortar, stood several stories tall and included an internal staircase cut through solid stone. Building something like this, at that point in human history, without metal tools, without the wheel in common use, and without any of the machinery later civilizations would develop, represents one of the earliest known feats of monumental engineering anywhere. The people who built it moved and stacked tons of stone by hand, organized a workforce capable of sustained construction, and produced a structure durable enough that its remains still stand today. Jericho, in other words, was a place with deep engineering roots long before any of the more famous events in its history. The reason for all this defensive investment comes down to location. Jericho sits near a permanent spring, a reliable source of fresh water in an otherwise dry region, and this single feature made it enormously valuable. A dependable water source in an arid landscape is worth defending because it means the difference between a settlement that survives and one that withers. The city also sat along important routes of travel and trade, adding to its strategic value. A place this valuable attracted both settlers and attackers, and the response across thousands of years was to build walls and then to build them again, higher and stronger, each time the city was threatened or destroyed and rebuilt. By the era most associated with the famous account, the city's defenses had developed into a sophisticated, multi-layered system, and understanding its actual construction is essential. Excavations revealed that the fortifications of this period were not a single wall, but a combined system built into and around the natural mound the city sat upon. This mound, called a tell, had itself grown over centuries as each generation built on top of the ruins of the last, gradually raising the entire city above the surrounding plain. Defending a city perched on top of such a mound required a specific engineering approach, and the builders of Jericho developed exactly that. At the base of the mound stood a stone retaining wall, several feet high, serving as a foundation and revetment. Its purpose was partly structural, holding back the earth of the mound and preventing the slope from eroding or collapsing, and partly defensive, presenting attackers with a solid stone barrier at the very bottom of the approach. On top of this stone base, and set back along the slope, rose walls of mud brick, the primary building material of the region. Mud brick, made from clay mixed with straw and dried in the sun, was abundant, cheap, and surprisingly effective for construction, though it carried one critical weakness that would become central to the story of the wall's collapse. The slope itself between these wall lines was a deliberate defensive feature. Rather than leaving a simple flat approach, the builders created a steep embankment, sometimes plastered smooth, running up from the base of the stone wall to the mud brick fortifications above. This kind of sloped rampart, found at fortified sites across the region, served a clear military purpose. It made approaching the upper walls physically exhausting and dangerous, exposed attackers to defenders above for a longer period, and prevented siege equipment from being easily brought up against the main walls. An attacker could not simply walk up to the base of the main wall and begin working. They first had to struggle up a steep, slick embankment under fire from above. The mud brick construction that formed the main defensive walls deserves closer attention, because it explains both the strength and the vulnerability of the system. Mud brick walls could be built thick and tall, and when well maintained, they provided formidable protection. But mud brick has a fundamental enemy: instability of its foundation. Unlike stone, which can flex slightly and settle, Mud brick is brittle and depends heavily on remaining rigid and dry. A mud brick wall built on ground that shifts, cracks, or gives way beneath it is acutely vulnerable to sudden catastrophic failure. This structural reality sits at the center of one of the most debated and interesting aspects of the entire Jericho story. The biblical account describes the walls falling suddenly and completely, collapsing outward and flat, allowing the attacking force to enter the city directly over the ruins. From a purely engineering standpoint, this description matches remarkably well with what happens to mud brick fortifications during a specific kind of event, an earthquake. Jericho sits in the Jordan Rift Valley, one of the most seismically active regions on Earth, a place where the Earth's crust is under constant tectonic stress and where earthquakes have been documented throughout recorded history. An earthquake striking a city built of mud brick on top of an artificial mound would produce exactly the kind of failure the account describes. The ground shakes, the foundations shift, and brittle mud brick walls, unable to absorb the movement, crack and collapse outward, tumbling down the slope and creating a ramp of rubble over which attackers could climb. The archaeological evidence has added a further layer to this picture. Excavations at the site uncovered fallen mud bricks piled at the base of the outer stone retaining wall in a way consistent with walls that had collapsed outward and downward, potentially forming exactly the kind of rubble ramp that would allow a force to enter. Some excavators also documented evidence of the city being destroyed by fire following the collapse, with layers of ash and burned debris consistent with a city that was taken and then burned. Whether one reads these findings through the lens of the biblical timeline or through a purely archaeological one, the physical evidence describes a city whose mud brick fortifications collapsed and which was subsequently burned, a sequence that aligns strikingly with the broad outline of the account. The collapse mechanism itself is worth understanding in engineering terms, setting aside the question of ultimate cause. When a wall collapses, the way it falls reveals a great deal about how it failed. A wall undermined by attackers digging beneath it tends to fall in a localized section. A wall broken by a battering ram fails at the point of impact, but a wall that falls suddenly along its entire length, collapsing flat and outward all at once, points to a failure of the foundation itself, a whole structure event rather than a localized breach. This is precisely the signature of ground failure, and it is precisely what both the account and, according to many interpretations, the archaeological record describe. The walls did not fail at one weak point, they failed everywhere, simultaneously, in the manner of a structure whose very foundation had given way beneath it. There is one more detail in the account that connects to the physical reality of the site. The story preserves the memory of a single portion of the wall that did not fall, the section where a woman named Rahab lived, described as having a house built into or against the wall itself. Houses built directly into city walls were a genuine architectural practice in crowded fortified settlements, where space was limited and the thick defensive walls offered a ready structure to build against. That a section of wall might remain partially standing while the rest collapsed is entirely consistent with how real structural failures behave. Collapses are rarely perfectly uniform. Sections built slightly differently, or standing on marginally more stable ground, can survive when everything around them falls, and the account's preservation of exactly such a surviving section reflects the uneven, unpredictable reality of how large structures actually come apart. Put the whole picture together, and Jericho emerges not as a simple story of walls falling, but as a portrait of one of humanity's oldest and most heavily fortified cities, defended by a layered system of stone and mud brick engineering refined over thousands of years, sitting on an artificial mound in one of the most earthquake-prone regions on the planet. The strength of that system was real, and so was its single great vulnerability. Mud brick, for all its usefulness, could not survive the ground moving beneath it, and in a place where the ground was known to move, that vulnerability was always waiting. The walls of Jericho, then, tell two engineering stories at once. The first is a story of remarkable achievement of a city that mastered fortification earlier and more thoroughly than almost anywhere else on Earth. The second is a story of limitation, of how even the most impressive walls, built of the wrong material in the wrong place, carried within them the exact weakness that would one day bring them down, suddenly and completely, in a manner that people would remember for thousands of years afterward.